The Unsung Heroes, Animals of the World Wars. A stellar narratives documentary. While war memorials typically honor soldiers, one silent monument in Hyde Park, London, tells a different story. In this stellar narratives documentary, we uncover the verified history of the millions of horses, dogs, and carrier pigeons that served on the front lines. From the trenches of the Western Front to the heavy, impossible weights carried by mules through the mountains, these animals had no choice. Yet they saved thousands of lives. Join us as we explore the emotional and atmospheric history of the animals that served alongside British and Allied forces. In Hyde Park, London, on the eastern edge of the city's most famous green space, there stands a monument unlike any other war memorial in the world. It is not a column. It is not an arch. There is no eternal flame, and no names are etched into its stone. Instead, you see a curved wall of Portland stone, 55 feet wide and 58 feet tall, carved with the silhouettes of struggling animals. Two bronze mules, heavily laden, climb the stairs of the monument as though carrying an impossible weight toward some unseen destination. Beyond the wall, a horse and a dog stand together in the open air, looking into the distance, as though they have finally passed through something terrible and survived. Two inscriptions mark the face of this monument. The first reads, "This monument is dedicated to all the animals that served and died alongside British and Allied forces in wars and campaigns throughout time." The second inscription is shorter, but it is carved in larger letters than all the rest. It reads simply, "They had no choice." Over 16 million animals served in the First World War alone. 8 million horses, donkeys, and mules died in that conflict. From shellfire, gas attacks, exhaustion, starvation, disease, and the freezing, sucking mud of the Western Front. 1 million dogs perished alongside them. Hundreds of thousands of pigeons, camels, and other creatures gave their lives in a war they could not possibly understand. In the Second World War, the numbers climbed again, and the species expanded. Dogs, horses, pigeons, camels, elephants, dolphins, sea lions, bears, cats, canaries, mules, and even glowworms were pressed into service across every theater of conflict on Earth. They carried ammunition through artillery barrages. They flew 150 miles through storms to deliver messages that saved entire battalions. They detected poison gas before any human nose could sense it. They pulled wounded men from the rubble of bombed-out buildings. They guarded trenches, located buried survivors, and kept ships free of the rats that threatened food supplies. And in at least one extraordinary case, a tiny 4-pound Yorkshire Terrier, found in an abandoned foxhole in the jungles of New Guinea, saved the lives of 250 men by threading a wire through an underground pipe in about 3 minutes. These are the stories that never made the front pages. These are the soldiers who never chose their war. They are the unsung heroes of the 20th century's deadliest conflicts. Creatures who walked, flew, swam, and crawled into the fire of modern warfare and changed its course forever. This is their story. Part 1. The Scale of It All. To understand why animals were so essential to the wars of the 20th century, you first need to understand how completely unprepared the world's armies were for the scale of what was about to happen. When the First World War broke out in August of 1914, the British Army owned roughly 25,000 horses. That number sounds reasonable, until you consider that the war they were about to fight would require hundreds of thousands of them. Within the first few weeks of the conflict, the Army requisitioned around 120,000 horses from the civilian population. Owners who could not prove that their animals were essential for farming or transport were required to hand them over. Families wrote desperate letters to the War Office, begging for their beloved ponies and workhorses to be spared. In response, the government decreed that no horse under 15 hands high would be taken. A small mercy, but one that offered little comfort to the thousands who watched their animals loaded onto trains and sent toward a war from which most would never return. But even this mass requisition was not enough. Britain's remount department turned to the international market, eventually spending over £36 million, the equivalent of roughly £1.5 billion in today's money, purchasing horses and mules from around the world, particularly from the United States and Canada. Between 1914 and 1918, the United States sent almost 1 million horses overseas. Another 182,000 were shipped with American troops when the U.S. entered the war. Of those nearly 1 million American horses sent to Europe, only 200 ever came home. By 1917, Britain alone had over 1 million horses and mules in service. When you add the animals used by France, Germany, Russia, and the other combatant nations, the total swells to something staggering. Over 16 million animals served in the First World War, in virtually every role imaginable. Horses and mules pulled artillery, ammunition wagons, ambulances, and supply carts. Donkeys and camels transported the wounded to field hospitals. Dogs served as messengers, sentries, scouts, and search and rescue workers. Pigeons carried critical communications across enemy lines. Canaries detected poison gas in the trenches and tunnels. Cats hunted the rats that infested every trench on the Western Front. And in ways no one anticipated, even the smallest creatures played a part. Soldiers in the pitch-black trenches of France collected bioluminescent glowworms in jars, using their faint natural light to read maps, intelligence reports, and letters from home, without giving away their position to the enemy. The terrain of the Western Front made animals not just useful, but absolutely indispensable. The landscape between the opposing trench lines, the infamous no man's land, was a nightmare of mud, water-filled craters, barbed wire, and shattered ground that no wheeled vehicle could cross. Even behind the lines, the roads were often so destroyed by shellfire and rain that motorized trucks became hopelessly stuck. Horses, mules, and donkeys could go where machines could not. They were, quite literally, the lifeline between the supply depots and the men dying at the front. And the cost of that service was beyond reckoning. Part 2. The Horses. Of all the animals that served in the First and Second World Wars, none suffered on a greater scale than the horse. Horses were the backbone of every army in 1914. They pulled the field guns, requiring 6 to 12 animals per gun, and hauled the supply wagons that kept entire divisions fed, watered, and armed. They carried cavalry soldiers into battle and transported officers across the vast networks of communication trenches behind the front. Without horses, the armies of the First World War simply could not have functioned. But the war that horses were sent into was unlike anything the animal kingdom had ever experienced. The Western Front was a hellscape of industrial killing, machine guns, heavy artillery, poison gas, barbed wire, and bottomless mud. Horses, bred for open fields and country roads, were suddenly forced to navigate a landscape that had been turned inside out by millions of explosive shells. The suffering was immense. Horses died from direct shell fire, from shrapnel wounds, from exposure to mustard gas, which clung to their hair and blistered their skin so that their manes were often clipped short to reduce the risk. They died from exhaustion, from starvation when supply lines failed, from diseases like glanders, a bacterial infection that caused horrific abscesses and a slow, agonizing death. Horses found with symptoms of glanders were ordered to be shot immediately. The conditions in the trenches and supply routes were brutal even for those animals that avoided enemy fire. Colic, mud fever, laminitis, respiratory infections, and rain scald were endemic. Horses stood for hours and sometimes days in waterlogged ground, their hooves rotting, their legs swelling, their spirits breaking. And military veterinarians noticed something remarkable and deeply troubling. Horses suffered from shell shock, the constant bombardment, the noise, the terror of explosions. It broke their minds just as it broke the minds of men. Veterinary officers observed that well-bred horses were more likely to suffer from psychological trauma, while hardier, less refined breeds could sometimes be trained to lie down and take cover at the sound of incoming artillery. The scale of equine casualties was staggering. At the Battle of Verdun in 1916, one of the longest and bloodiest battles in human history, 7,000 horses were killed by long-range shelling in a single day. In one incident, 97 horses were killed by a single shot from a French naval gun. Across the entire war, approximately 8 million horses, donkeys, and mules died. In Britain alone, 484,000 horses were killed, roughly 1 horse for every 2 men lost. Behind the lines, veterinary hospitals worked around the clock to save as many animals as possible. British vets treated 2.5 million horses during the war, and 2 million of them recovered enough to be returned to the battlefield. A typical horse hospital could handle 2,000 animals at any one time, and the work was exhausting. It could take up to 12 hours just to clean a single horse and its harness. Some animals that could not be saved were dispatched as humanely as possible, using a single-shot device fired into the skull. And for the horses that died in the field, there was one final indignity. Their bodies were sometimes used as barriers, soldiers crouching behind the carcasses of dead horses to shield themselves from enemy fire. French troops, with grim ingenuity, even created hollowed-out dummy horses to use as camouflaged observation posts in no man's land. But amid this ocean of suffering, there were individual stories of courage and resilience that captured the imagination of soldiers and civilians alike. Stories that remind us that even in the worst of circumstances, spirit can endure. The most famous of these stories belongs to a horse named Warrior. Warrior was a thoroughbred, born in April of 1908 on the Isle of Wight, just a few miles from the home of General Jack Seeley, who would become his rider and lifelong companion. With his bold head and fearless eye, Warrior was not a large horse, but he had an unmistakable air of courage about him, a quality that would be tested beyond anything anyone could have imagined. Warrior arrived on the Western Front on August the 11th, 1914, just days after the war began, and he stayed for the entire conflict. He fought at the Somme. He fought at Ypres. He was caught in machine gun fire. He was shelled repeatedly. At Passchendaele, he was buried alive under debris and sucking mud, and somehow survived. Time and again the men around him fell, but Warrior kept going. The soldiers began to say that the bullet had not been made that could finish him, and he earned a title that would follow him for the rest of his life: the horse the Germans could not kill. In March of 1918, Warrior and Seeley participated in one of history's last great cavalry charges. At the Battle of Moreuil Wood, Canadian cavalry, mounted on horseback, charged German positions supported by machine gun fire. It was a desperate, almost medieval act in a modern war. 3/4 of the cavalry were killed or wounded, but the charge succeeded, and Warrior, as always, came through. When the war finally ended, Warrior was one of the lucky ones. He went home to the Isle of Wight, where he lived peacefully for another 2 decades. He died in 1941, at the remarkable age of 33. The Times of London ran his obituary under the headline, "The horse the Germans could not kill." In 2014, 100 years after he first set hoof on the battlefields of France, Warrior was posthumously awarded an honorary Dickin medal, not just for himself, but on behalf of every animal that served in the First World War. Their sacrifice, the medal's creators acknowledged, had come before the award even existed. It was an honor long overdue. But Warrior's happy ending was the exception, not the rule. Of the roughly 1 million British horses that served in the First World War, only 60,000 made it back to Britain. Many were deemed too expensive to ship home. Instead, 500,000 were sold to French farmers to help rebuild the devastated countryside. Others were sold into labor markets across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. The fate of these sold horses is one of the most heartbreaking footnotes of the entire war. In the 1930s, a woman named Dorothy Brooke, living in Egypt, encountered former British war horses still at work, more than 15 years after the war had ended. They were, in her words, walking skeletons. Overworked, malnourished, and broken, they were barely recognizable as the proud animals that had once served king and country. Dorothy wrote a letter to the Morning Post newspaper in London, describing what she had found. The response was overwhelming. Donations flooded in from a British public that had never forgotten its war horses. With that money, Dorothy founded the Old War Horse Memorial Hospital in Cairo, which would eventually grow into the Brooke, the world's largest equine welfare charity. And there is one final image from the aftermath of the Great War that deserves to be remembered. When the body of the unknown warrior was brought to Westminster Abbey in 1920, a single unidentified soldier chosen to represent all those who had died, the gun carriage bearing his coffin was pulled by 6 black horses. All 6 had survived the war together. It was, perhaps, the only fitting tribute that the nameless dead should be carried to their rest by the animals who had shared their suffering, their courage, and their silence. Part 3. The Pigeons. If horses were the backbone of the war effort, then pigeons were its nervous system, the fragile, feathered threads that connected commanders to their men and carried the information that could mean the difference between victory and annihilation. Homing pigeons had been used as messengers for thousands of years, dating back to the ancient Egyptians and Persians. But during the First and Second World Wars, their role became absolutely critical. In an era before reliable radio communication, when telephone wires were constantly being cut by shell fire and human runners were mowed down by machine guns, pigeons were often the only way to send a message from the front lines back to headquarters. The numbers involved were enormous. Over 300,000 pigeons were used across both world wars by American, British, and European forces, and their success rate was astonishing. American and Allied pigeons reported a message delivery rate of approximately 95%. Their importance was so great that the British government, under the Defence of the Realm Act, made it a criminal offence to kill, wound, or molest a homing pigeon. Anyone caught doing so could be fined or imprisoned. On the other side of the lines, the Germans deployed trained hawks and falcons specifically to intercept and kill Allied messenger pigeons. An aerial arms race fought not between planes, but between birds. The pigeons faced deadly obstacles on every flight. Enemy snipers shot at them. Hawks pursued them. Weather battered them. And yet, time and again, they flew through it all, navigating by instinct across hundreds of miles of unfamiliar, war-torn landscape to deliver the scraps of paper that saved battalions. Of the many pigeons who served with extraordinary distinction, 3 stories stand out above all others. The first belongs to a pigeon named Cher Ami, French for dear friend. Cher Ami was a homing pigeon donated by the United Kingdom to the United States Army Signal Corps during the First World War. He served in France, where he carried 12 messages in total, but it was his final flight, on October 4th, 1918, that earned him a place in military legend. On that day, a force of roughly 550 American soldiers from the 77th Infantry Division had advanced deep into the Argonne forest. They were cut off from the rest of the army, surrounded by German forces, and, in a cruel twist, being bombarded by their own artillery. American guns, unaware that their men had pushed so far forward, were shelling the very position where the trapped battalion was trying to survive. The soldiers had no working radio. Their telephone lines had been destroyed, and every human runner they sent out was killed or captured before reaching friendly lines. They had one last hope: a pigeon. Cher Ami was released with a desperate message attached to his leg. "We are along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." As Cher Ami took flight, German soldiers opened fire. The pigeon was hit, shot through the breast and the leg. He tumbled from the sky. The soldiers watching from below must have felt their last hope die with him. But Cher Ami did not die. Somehow, despite a shattered leg and a hole in his chest, he found the air again. He flew 25 miles in 65 minutes, arriving at his loft with the message still dangling from the ligament of his nearly severed leg. The message was read. The artillery barrage was stopped, and nearly 200 men of what became known as the Lost Battalion were saved. Cher Ami survived his injuries, though he lost the leg and the sight in one eye. He was awarded the French Croix de Guerre for his heroism. He died less than a year later, in 1919, from the cumulative effects of his wounds. His preserved body, with his medal and the message capsule, is displayed to this day at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. The second story takes us forward in time to the most important day of the Second World War. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Allied forces launched the largest amphibious invasion in history, storming the beaches of Normandy to begin the liberation of Europe from Nazi occupation. In the chaos of that morning, with thousands of ships crossing the English Channel and hundreds of thousands of men wading onto hostile shores, reliable communication was a matter of life and death. Among the tools prepared for that day were messenger pigeons, and one of the most important was a bird named Gustav. Gustav was a Royal Air Force messenger pigeon, one of 6 birds given to war correspondent Montague Taylor before the invasion. As the landings began, Gustav was released from the coast of France, carrying the first news of D-Day, back to Britain. He flew more than 150 miles across the English Channel, from Normandy to his loft near Portsmouth, in just over 5 hours. Gustav carried the first report of the Allied landings to reach British soil, before any radio transmission, before any official dispatch. For this feat, he was awarded the Dickin Medal in September of 1944. The third story is, in some ways, the most poignant, because it involves a pigeon who delivered no message at all. In February of 1942, a Royal Air Force Bristol Beaufort bomber was on patrol over the coast of Norway when it ran into trouble. The engines failed, and the aircraft was forced to crash land in the freezing waters of the North Sea, more than 100 miles from home. The four-man crew managed to escape the sinking plane and scramble into an inflatable dinghy. They had sent out a weak distress signal before crashing, but their base at RAF Lushars had no way of knowing exactly where they were. The crew had carrier pigeons with them in a basket, but in the chaos of the crash, one bird broke free and took off before anyone could attach a message to her. That bird was Winkie. Winkie flew through the cold, across the open sea, oily and exhausted, and eventually arrived at her loft in Scotland. She carried no message, but her arrival told the rescue teams something vital. Based on the time of her arrival, the direction she had come from, and her bedraggled condition, they were able to estimate how far the crew had drifted and roughly where they might be. A search was launched. The crew was found and rescued. In gratitude, the four airmen held a formal dinner in Winkie's honor, and she was present as the guest of honor. In December of 1943, when the Dickin Medal was inaugurated by Maria Dickin to recognize animal gallantry in wartime, Winkie was among the first 3 recipients, the very first animals to receive what would come to be known as the Animals Victoria Cross. Part 4. The Dogs. If there is one thing that the World Wars proved beyond any doubt, it is that the bond between humans and dogs is unbreakable, even in the most hellish conditions imaginable. Dogs served in both world wars in an astonishing variety of roles. They were messengers, carrying dispatches between units when no human runner could survive the crossing. They were sentries, standing guard over trenches and camps, their acute hearing able to detect the approach of an enemy patrol long before any soldier could. They were scouts, trained to work in absolute silence, accompanying reconnaissance patrols into no man's land and beyond. Some scouting dogs could detect enemy presence up to 1,000 feet away, signaling danger by freezing in place, stiffening their body, and holding their tail straight, a posture eerily similar to the pointing behavior of hunting dogs in the field. Dogs searched for wounded men on the battlefield, locating soldiers buried under rubble or collapsed in shell craters by following their scent. They carried first aid supplies strapped to their bodies, bringing medical equipment directly to the injured. They hunted the rats that infested every trench, bunker, and supply depot on the Western Front. They helped lay telephone wire across contested ground, and they served as something no piece of military equipment could ever replace, a source of comfort, warmth, and normalcy for men who had not known any of those things in months or years. Over 1 million dogs are believed to have died in the First World War alone. In the Second World War, the United States launched a program called Dogs for Defense after the attack on Pearl Harbor, asking civilian pet owners to donate their dogs for military service, for patrol, guard duty, mine detection, and messenger work. Thousands of American families gave up their pets to serve. Of the countless dogs who served, 2 stories capture the full range of what these animals were capable of, from the battlefields of France in 1917 to the jungles of the Pacific in 1944. The first is the story of Sergeant Stubby. Stubby was a stray, a stout, short-tailed Staffordshire Terrier mix who wandered onto the campus of Yale University in the summer of 1917. where American soldiers were training for deployment to France. A young private named Robert Conroy took a liking to the scrappy little dog and began feeding him. When the time came for Conroy's unit to ship out, he smuggled Stubby aboard the troop transport in his overcoat. When Stubby was eventually discovered by the commanding officer, the little dog had already endeared himself to the entire unit. And then he did something remarkable. He raised his right paw in a perfect salute. The officer, charmed, granted Stubby official mascot status and sent him to the Western Front with the 102nd Infantry Regiment of the 26th Yankee Division. What happened next would make Stubby the most famous dog of the First World War, and arguably the most decorated war dog in history. Stubby served for 18 months on the Western Front, participating in 17 battles. His senses were extraordinary. He could detect the approach of mustard gas before any human could smell it, and on one occasion his frantic warning alerted an entire company to put on their gas masks, saving every man in the unit. He could hear the whine of incoming artillery shells before they landed, giving soldiers precious seconds to take cover. He could locate wounded men on the battlefield by scent, leading stretcher bearers to soldiers who might otherwise have been left to die. And then there was the spy. According to reports covered by the New York Times, Stubby once encountered a German soldier in the trenches who was mapping Allied positions. The little dog seized the man by the seat of his trousers and held him there, growling, refusing to let go, until American soldiers arrived to take the spy into custody. By the end of the war, Stubby had been wounded by shrapnel, gassed, and had survived more close calls than most human soldiers. He was promoted to the rank of sergeant through combat, the only dog in history to receive that distinction through battlefield service. He was awarded numerous medals and decorations, and when he returned to the United States, he became a national celebrity. He met 3 presidents. His stuffed body, decorated with his war medals, is displayed at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., where it can still be seen today. The second story is smaller in scale, but no less extraordinary, because it belongs to the tiniest war veteran you could possibly imagine. Smoky was a Yorkshire Terrier. She weighed 4 pounds, she stood 7 inches tall, and she was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable animals to serve in the Second World War. In February of 1944, an American soldier found a small, bedraggled dog in an abandoned foxhole in the jungles of New Guinea. The soldiers initially thought she might belong to the Japanese, but she didn't respond to commands in Japanese, or in English for that matter. No one knew where she had come from. She was a mystery wrapped in 4 pounds of tangled fur. Another soldier bought her and then, needing money for a poker game, sold her to Corporal William Wynne of Cleveland, Ohio, for 2 Australian pounds, about $6.44. It was the best investment Wynne would ever make. Over the next 2 years, Smoky and Wynne were inseparable. The tiny dog rode in Wynne's backpack, ate his sea rations, and slept in his tent. Together, they served with the 5th Air Force's 26th Photo Reconnaissance Squadron across the Pacific Theater. Smoky survived more than 150 Japanese air raids in New Guinea. She flew 12 combat reconnaissance and rescue missions. She endured a typhoon on Okinawa, and she once saved Wynne's life aboard a landing craft when she urgently warned him to take cover moments before an attack. The 8 men standing near him were all killed. But Smoky's most famous exploit came in January of 1945 at Lingayen Gulf on the island of Luzon in the Philippines. The Allied airfield at Lingayen was under constant attack from Japanese aircraft. Engineers desperately needed to run telegraph wire through a 70-foot-long drainage pipe that ran beneath the airstrip connecting the base to 3 separate squadrons. The pipe was only 8 inches in diameter, far too small for any human to enter. Soil had sifted through the corrugated joints, filling some sections to half capacity, leaving as little as 4 inches of clearance. The alternative was to dig up the pipe by hand, a job that would take roughly 70 men about 3 days, shutting down the runway entirely and exposing the workers to daily air attacks. In that time, the lives of hundreds of men and dozens of aircraft would be at risk. Someone had an idea. They would tie a string to Smoky's collar, the string attached to the communication wire, and send her through the pipe. Win went to one end of the culvert. Smoky was placed at the other. She started forward, then hesitated and ran back. Win called to her again, sharply this time. She started through a second time. About 10 feet in, the string caught on something, and she looked over her shoulder as if to say, "What's holding us up?" But she kept going, through the darkness, through the dirt, through the cramped, suffocating pipe, until, about 20 feet from the end, Win saw 2 small amber eyes glowing in the darkness and heard a faint whimper. At 15 feet, she broke into a run. She burst out of the pipe, and Win and the engineers celebrated for a solid 5 minutes. The job that would have taken 70 men 3 days was completed in about 3 minutes by a 4-pound dog. The communication lines were established. The airfield stayed open. Smoky was credited with saving approximately 250 men and 40 aircraft. But Smoky's legacy extends beyond the battlefield into something even more important. While Win was hospitalized with dengue fever in New Guinea, his friends brought Smoky to visit him. The nurses at the 233rd Station Hospital, charmed by the little dog, asked if they could take her on patient rounds. Over the next 5 days, Smoky visited wounded soldiers arriving from the Biak Island invasion. The effect was immediate and profound. Men who had been silent and withdrawn began talking and laughing. The tiny dog chased enormous butterflies across the hospital ward, and soldiers who hadn't smiled in weeks smiled at the sight of her. The nurses collected her in the morning and returned her to Win at night. This is now recognized as one of the earliest documented instances of animal-assisted therapy. Smoky is widely credited as the world's first therapy dog, a role she continued after the war, visiting veterans' hospitals across the United States with Win for years. After the war, Smoky became a national celebrity. She appeared on 42 live television shows without ever repeating a trick. She could walk a tightrope while blindfolded. She learned over 200 commands and hand signals. She performed for millions. Smoky died on February the 21st, 1957, at the approximate age of 14. Win buried her in a World War II ammunition box in the Rocky River Reservation outside Cleveland, Ohio, near a beech tree where he and his wife had carved their initials years earlier. For nearly 50 years, her grave was unmarked. Then, in 2005, a Vietnam veteran raised the money to commission a memorial. A sculptor crafted a life-size bronze statue of Smoky sitting inside a GI helmet, an image taken from one of Win's wartime photographs. It was unveiled on Veterans Day, November the 11th, 2005, atop a polished blue granite pedestal that stands directly over Smoky's grave. The inscription dedicates the memorial to the animals of all wars. There were other heroic dogs whose stories deserve to be told. Jet was an Alsatian trained as a search and rescue dog during the London Blitz. He and his handler recovered 150 people from the wreckage of bombed buildings. On one occasion, Jet located a woman buried beneath a collapsed hotel and refused to leave the spot for 12 hours while rescuers dug her out. He was awarded the Dickin Medal in January of 1945. And there was Rags, a scruffy stray mutt found on the streets of Paris and adopted by the American 1st Division as their mascot and messenger. Rags learned to carry messages between units, to detect incoming shells by the vibration of their flight, dropping flat to the ground before they struck, and even to locate broken communication wires so they could be repaired. He was a street dog who became a soldier, and his story, like so many others, is one of accidental heroism, of an animal thrust into circumstances it could never have understood, who rose to meet them with extraordinary courage. Part 5. The Unlikely Heroes. War has a way of finding the most improbable heroes, and among the animals of the world wars, none were more improbable or more beloved than a Syrian brown bear named Wojtek. Wojtek's story begins in 1942 when a group of Polish soldiers, freed from Soviet labor camps and making their way through Iran to join the Allied war effort, encountered a young boy by the side of the road holding a small bear cub. The cub's mother had been killed by hunters. The soldiers bought the orphan for a few coins and a tin of food, and the 22nd Transport Artillery Supply Company of the Polish Second Corps suddenly found itself in possession of a bear. They named him Wojtek, which translates roughly to Happy Warrior, or more affectionately, Little One. Though little would not describe him for long. Wojtek grew to over 6 feet tall and weighed approximately 250 pounds. He drank beer from bottles. He ate cigarettes, literally ate them, developing a lifelong taste for tobacco. He wrestled and play-fought with the soldiers, who treated him not as a pet, but as a comrade. He slept in their tents, rode in their trucks, and followed them wherever they went. In 1943, the unit was posted to Italy. But there was a problem. The ship that would transport them did not allow animals on board. So the Polish soldiers did the only logical thing. They officially enlisted Wojtek into the Polish army. He was given a service number, assigned the rank of private, and entered the military record books as an actual soldier of the Polish Second Corps. During the brutal Battle of Monte Cassino, one of the most savage engagements of the Italian campaign, Wojtek found his true calling. He watched the soldiers carrying heavy crates of artillery shells to the front lines, and he began to imitate them. Standing on his hind legs, the bear carried 25-pound ammunition boxes and heavy shells from supply trucks to the gun positions, making trip after trip without being asked or trained. The soldiers were astonished. Wojtek was doing the work of a man and doing it with apparent enthusiasm. His image, a bear carrying an artillery shell, was later incorporated into the official insignia of the 22nd Transport Artillery Supply Company, where it remains to this day. After the war, Wojtek could not return to Poland, which had fallen under Soviet control. He was brought to Scotland, where he spent his remaining years at Edinburgh Zoo. Polish veterans would visit him regularly, and according to keepers, Wojtek would perk up at the sound of Polish being spoken. Some of the old soldiers would climb into his enclosure to wrestle with him, just as they had in the deserts of Iran and the mountains of Italy. They tossed him cigarettes. He caught them and ate them. Wojtek died in 1963 at the age of 21. Statues of him stand in Edinburgh, London, and several cities in Poland. He is remembered not as a war mascot, but as something more. A creature who shared the burden of war with the men around him, not because he was forced to, but because he had come to see them as his family. But Wojtek was not the only unlikely hero. The world wars pressed into service creatures so small and so strange that their contributions seem almost impossible to believe. In the trenches and underground tunnels of the Western Front, canaries served as the first line of defense against one of the war's most terrifying weapons: poison gas. Canaries are extraordinarily sensitive to airborne toxins. Their small bodies and rapid metabolisms mean they react to dangerous gases long before a human would feel any symptoms. When a canary showed signs of distress, wobbling, gasping, collapsing, soldiers knew that toxic gas was present and that they had mere seconds to put on their gas masks. This practice was not new. Canaries had been used in coal mines for decades for the same purpose. But in the trenches, where gas attacks could arrive without warning, and where death was invisible and odorless, these tiny birds were living alarm systems. Their sacrifice saved countless lives, though few survived the very gases they detected. And then there were the glowworms. It is one of the strangest and most poignant details of the First World War. In the pitch blackness of the trenches, where any artificial light could draw sniper fire or reveal a position to the enemy, soldiers needed a way to read in the dark. Maps had to be studied. Intelligence reports had to be deciphered. Orders had to be read. And letters from home, those precious scraps of connection to a world that still existed beyond the mud and wire, needed light. The solution was found in nature. Soldiers collected glowworms, bioluminescent insects whose bodies produce a faint, greenish light through a chemical reaction in their cells, and gathered them in glass jars. The glow was dim, barely enough to make out the words on a page, but it was enough, and it was invisible to the enemy. It is almost impossible to picture it. Men in the most technologically advanced war the world had ever seen, surrounded by machine guns and artillery and poison gas, reading their letters by the light of worms in a jar. But that is exactly what happened, and in its own small way, it is one of the most human, and most animal, stories of the entire war. And finally, there is the story of Simon. Simon was a cat, a black and white ship's cat aboard HMS Amethyst of the Royal Navy. The crew had adopted him in Hong Kong, and he quickly became a beloved presence aboard the ship, providing the companionship and comfort that only a cat can offer to men at sea. In April of 1949, during the Chinese Civil War, HMS Amethyst was sailing up the Yangtze River when communist forces opened fire. The ship took more than 50 direct hits. 17 crew members were killed. Simon was found badly injured, burned, riddled with shrapnel in his legs, his whiskers singed off. The ship was trapped. For more than 10 weeks, HMS Amethyst sat in the Yangtze, unable to move, blockaded by hostile forces. And in that time, a new enemy emerged: rats. The ship was infested. Rats devoured food supplies and even attacked injured crew members in the makeshift sick bay. Simon, despite his wounds, went to work. He hunted relentlessly, killing rat after rat, including a notoriously large one that the crew had nicknamed Mao Zedong. He was promoted to able seaman for his efforts. And beyond the practical matter of pest control, Simon did something equally important. He provided comfort. He visited the injured sailors, curling up with them, offering a moment of normalcy in the midst of a crisis. For his actions, Simon was awarded the Dickin Medal, the only cat in history to receive the honor. He also received the Amethyst Campaign Medal and the Naval General Service Medal. Tragically, Simon did not enjoy his fame for long. Required to undergo quarantine upon entering the United Kingdom, he developed a virus linked to his war wounds and died on November 28, 1949. Hundreds attended his funeral at the PDSA Animal Cemetery in East London, including the entire crew of HMS Amethyst. To this day, Simon remains the only cat ever to have received the animal's Victoria Cross. Part 6. The Medal They Earned. In 1943, at the height of the Second World War, a woman named Maria Dickin did something that had never been done before. She created a medal, not for soldiers, not for generals, not for heads of state, but for animals. Maria Dickin was the founder of the People's Dispensary for Sick Animals, known as the PDSA, a British veterinary charity that provided free treatment for the pets of people who could not afford a vet. Throughout the war, she had watched with growing admiration as animals of every kind displayed courage and devotion in the service of the military and civil defense. She believed they deserved recognition. The medal she created is a large bronze medallion, bearing the words "For Gallantry" and "We Also Serve" within a laurel wreath. Its ribbon is striped in 3 colors: green for earth, dark brown for water, and pale blue for air, representing the land, naval, and air forces in which these animals served. It was called the PDSA Dickin Medal. The public, however, gave it a simpler name, the Animal's Victoria Cross. Since its creation, the Dickin Medal has been awarded 75 times, plus 1 honorary award. The recipients include 38 dogs, 32 pigeons, 4 horses, and 1 cat. The first medals, awarded in December of 1943, went to 3 pigeons, including Winkie, for their roles in rescuing downed aircrews. The most recent recipient is a Belgian Malinois named Bass, who served with the U.S. Marine Special Operations Command in Afghanistan. The honorary Dickin Medal, awarded in 2014, went to Warrior, the horse the Germans could not kill, on behalf of every animal that served in the First World War. Their sacrifice predated the award by decades, but it was fitting that the horse who had come to symbolize equine courage should finally wear the medal that their service had always deserved. The inscription on the medal reads, "We also serve." It is perhaps the most modest understatement in the history of military honors. Part 7. What we owe them. When we tally the cost of the world wars in human terms, the 65 million soldiers mobilized for the First World War, the millions killed, the tens of millions wounded, the civilian populations shattered, the numbers are almost too large to comprehend. But there is another accounting that is rarely made, the accounting of the animals. 8 million horses, donkeys, and mules died in the First World War. 1 million dogs perished. Hundreds of thousands of pigeons, camels, and other animals gave their lives. In the Second World War, the toll continued. Though the mechanization of armies meant that fewer horses were needed, the roles of dogs, pigeons, and other animals expanded into new theaters and new technologies of war. And there is one number that is rarely spoken of, one that reveals a dimension of wartime suffering that most people have never heard of. At the start of the Second World War, the British government issued a pamphlet advising citizens that food rationing was imminent and that pet food would become a luxury the country could not afford. The pamphlet suggested that families consider having their pets put down. Despite some voices in the press urging people to reject this advice, the public largely complied. In a single week, an estimated 750,000 British pets, dogs, cats, and other companion animals, were euthanized by their owners. It was a mass killing driven by fear and uncertainty, and it represents one of the forgotten tragedies of the home front. These animals, all of them, from the horses who pulled the guns to the canaries who detected the gas, from the pigeons who flew through enemy fire to the glowworms who lit the darkness, shared one thing in common. They had no understanding of politics, borders, ideology, or empire. They could not read a newspaper. They could not vote for or against a war. They did not know that the world was tearing itself apart, or why. They simply followed the humans they trusted. They went where their humans went. They carried what their humans needed. They warned their humans of dangers they could not explain. And they stayed, through the mud and the gas and the fire and the cold, because that is what animals do. They stay. There is a phrase that soldiers have used for centuries to describe the experience of war. The fog of war. The confusion, the terror, the inability to see what is happening around you. For the animals of the world wars, there was no fog. There was only trust. They trusted the men and women who fed them, who cared for them, who asked them to carry one more load, fly one more mission, crawl through one more pipe. And they did it, not for medals, not for glory, not for country, but because they were asked. That is their legacy, and it is more powerful than any monument, any medal, or any book could ever capture. In Hyde Park, as the evening light falls across the Portland stone, the bronze mules still climb their endless stairs. The horse and the dog still stand beyond the wall, gazing into a future they helped to create. On the back of the memorial, facing away from the road, away from the traffic and the tourists, there is a final inscription. It reads, "Many and various animals were employed to support British and Allied forces in wars and campaigns over the centuries, and as a result, millions died. From the pigeon to the elephant, they all played a vital role in every region of the world in the cause of human freedom. Their contribution must never be forgotten." In the United Kingdom, a purple poppy is sometimes worn alongside the traditional red poppy of Remembrance Day. The red poppy honors the human dead. The purple poppy honors the animals. And the work of animals in warfare did not end with the world wars. To this day, dogs detect improvised explosive devices in conflict zones. Dolphins, trained by the United States Navy, locate underwater mines. The therapy dogs who visit wounded veterans in hospitals around the world trace their lineage directly back to a tiny Yorkshire Terrier named Smoky, who first visited wounded soldiers in a jungle hospital in New Guinea in 1944. We build monuments to generals and prime ministers. We name streets after battles and ships after victories. But in the quiet corner of a London park, there stands a wall with the names of no men, only the outlines of the creatures who carried us, guided us, warned us, fed us, and comforted us through the darkest hours of the 20th century. They could not speak. They could not refuse. And most of them never came home. They had no choice. But we have one, to remember them and their sacrifice. Thank you for listening. If this documentary moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue telling the stories that history has forgotten. Now, as you heard, this documentary touched on many different kinds of animals: the horses, the pigeons, the dogs, the bears, the cats, the canaries, and many more. Each of those stories could fill an entire documentary on its own. So here is what I would like to ask you. If you would like to see a full, dedicated documentary exploring the wartime story of one of these animals in much greater depth, whether it is the horses, the pigeons, the dogs, the bears, or any of the other creatures we discussed today. Leave a comment below and tell me which animal you would most like to hear about. Your comments will help shape what comes next on this channel. So, let your voice be heard. Thank you for listening to Unsung Heroes, Animals of the World Wars. If you'd like another powerful story, tap the link in the top right to watch our documentary on the RAF Balloon Command, the overlooked weapon used to devastate the enemy infrastructure during the Second World War. And if you enjoy controversial histories, unsolved mysteries, and stories that make you think, then please subscribe to Stellar Narratives. We hunt down history's most fascinating and occasionally controversial stories and mysteries for your entertainment. So sit back and enjoy the ride.